again, welcome everyone. Please note that this meeting, this event will be recorded, and the recording of this event will be shared after this event will end. If you don't want to be on the recording of this event, this means that you have to leave, because otherwise you will appear on this event recording. Yeah, so hopefully this is clear for you. And yeah, I'm happy that we can start the event today, and let me share my screen. So, and Jan, please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, it works perfect. We're set.
Great, yeah. I hope everyone can see it. If you don't see it, yeah, please let us know. Is it visible to you or not? Everyone should be able to see the screen. Great. Yeah, so my name is Rozia Kirgizbekova. I am advisor at the Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement, the secretariat of which is hosted by the GIZ Support Project for Implementation of the Paris Agreement. And today, together with Jan, we will be presenting to you the NDC Handover Checklist. And please, Jan, introduce also yourself to everyone.
Thank you, Rosia. Good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I'm Jan Sindt, Head of Implementation Strategies over at Climate Analytics in Berlin and in my case, Hamburg. Climate Analytics is a non-profit organization trying to deliver scientific advice to bring countries on par with the Paris Agreement and basically help them align with 1.5 compatible development pathways. We've been working mostly with CIDs and LDCs on supporting NDC revision processes, and hence this is why I'm here. Thanks.
Great. Yeah, then happy to start our today's session. And before we will start, yeah, just a short reminder, please keep your microphone muted when you don't speak. Turn on your camera if your internet connections allows it, and please do turn your microphone on and your camera on when you want to ask question or comment. And do feel free to use the chat for posting your questions and comments, and raise your hand when you want to say something. And another reminder that this event will be recorded, and the recording will be available after the event. Today, we will start with the context, with the background information of why this NDC handover checklist was developed, what was the process for developing this NDC handover checklist, and then we will move into the deep dive, what is actually in this checklist, what is its purpose, and how it can be useful to countries, to partners that are working on their NDC revisions or planning to update their NDCs. We will have a bigger discussion session where everyone is feel free to pose their questions and comments, and then we will finish with the outlook and closing session. So the idea of developing this NDC handover checklist, the background behind developing the NDC handover checklist, is based on the experiences and the observations that were made during the 2020-2021 NDC revision that was happening in many countries of the world. And there were three main observations that were really standing out and were very resonating in many countries, and therefore we also thought that some way of addressing these challenges, these lessons learned, may help countries to prepare for the next round of the NDC revision. Among the key aspects that were noticed is that the limited background information and data on how the first NDC or INDC was developed was a key factor that required additional resources in order to close these gaps of information and data that was missing, meaning that capacity resources, financial resources that needed to be allocated in order to conduct background researches and sector analyses. This lack of required information also led to delays in holding discussions among different stakeholders within the country, among different sectors, between different ministries and agencies, and to make decisions, to identify options of how to go further in terms of the processes that need for example, stakeholder coordination, management, as well as what type of NDC the country aims to develop, or how the country aims to update the NDC. The second important observation is that in many countries, or almost in all countries, external partners, development partners, were supporting the country in updating their NDCs, and whether it was support through modeling for a certain sector, developing scenarios for the certain sector, conducting assessments for climate impacts, through using different methods and approaches. So this meant that there was some sort of segregated approaches, segregated use of methods that also caused some challenges how to align and coordinate it best. And lastly, one of the most persistent and common issues that many countries are experiencing, especially in the relevant ministries, it is the high staff turnover, which then results in insufficient or limited institutional memory of previous processes. For example, again, how the first NDC was developed, who were involved in this process, what type of information was collected, and where basically this information is stored. So limited institutional memory and limited capacity for knowledge management was another key area that was observed, and basically was the basis for developing this NDC checklist. And how the NDC checklist was designed, the first draft of this checklist is the collaborative product of GIZ and Climate Analytics. We had these brainstorming sessions, after which we developed the draft, and we shared this draft very widely among all development partners who were helping countries in updating their NDCs, and these were partners such as those commonly known, such as UNDP, UNEP, IRENA, NDC Partnership Support Unit, also consulting companies who also were very closely involved in updating country NDCs. So overall, this was about 30 countries whose experiences and lessons learned were fed into the development of this NDC handover checklist. And the main purpose, basically, or the main aim of the NDC handover checklist is try to address, as I mentioned, these challenges or that were experienced or that were quite obvious from this latest NDC revision process. And first of all, how to not lose all the information and all the knowledge that was generated and created through this round of NDC update process. This refers knowledge about the coordination process, knowledge about the stakeholder engagement and all the actors that were involved in it, as well as all the methods and tools and resources that were used for developing the sector analyses, for developing the scenarios, and basically all the raw data, as well as all the reports that were produced, how these can be recorded and preserved. Secondly, we find that such depth of information of actors and of useful resource tools and methods can be very also helpful for countries to make use of those in preparing their different reports under the enhanced transparency framework. Such information can also well be fed into the development of long-term strategies. So the complementarity of the NDC checklist to other processes is noticeable. And lastly, we would like in this NDC checklist to provide opportunity and space for the key stakeholders, mainly the NDC focal point, the ministries and key actors that were involved in this NDC revision, to collect their recommendations, their reflections and key observations from this round in order to prepare better for the future NDC revision processes. This could be reflections on what needs to be done in order to avoid certain challenges, or recommendations of steps that need to be taken to make sure that the revision is efficient, that all stakeholders are involved in other key aspects. So these were the three main objectives that we have identified for the checklist, but of course they are not limited only to these. And then in the next part, I would like to hand over to Jan, who will have this deep dive and share with us what is included in the checklist. Please, Jan.
Thank you, Hosea. So let's first start with a brief overview of what's actually on the checklist. And this is just what we came up with in this effort with 30 countries and organizations involved as the most important parts. But you may find that some of them are probably not relevant in every case, while some might also be missing. For instance, if you have something on loss and damage in your NDC, that is probably relevant too. And therefore, this is only a list that can obviously always be adjusted. But we are pretty confident that the main things are on here, and at least everything that we came across is covered. So the checklist is 24 pages long, roughly, and has one short section with key information on country and year and stuff like that. And then a scoping section, an external support section, one for the coordination and one for the stakeholder engagement, then obviously for mitigation modeling, for adaptation, and then linkages with other processes, and something on the drafting process for the NDC, and finally the submission process. So Hosea, if you would like to click once so we can see what it looks like. Doesn't seem to work. We have a very simple format for this. We decided to just use the word document. There we go. And that makes it easily adjustable to the situation on the ground, because obviously every NDC is different. That's the whole point. And therefore, it's also obvious that you want to record whatever is relevant in your particular national circumstances. And therefore, we thought it best to have something very simple that can easily be adjusted. It's simply a Word document, and obviously easy to add whatever is required or just delete sections you don't need. It's also, while it looks quite voluminous with 24 pages in total, it's also not necessarily the case that you need to fill in everything in order to make this a useful exercise. So I've run a test run basically on how long it would take me for a small country we worked with to just fill it in, and it is about 1 hour of effort to take into account everything that I, at least working with the country, was aware of. And I think in it will save much more than 1 hour in the process of revising the NDC next time around, if all of this information is already available and you don't have to run through calls and discussions by email with your implementing partners to unearth that information again. So with that, I think we should briefly go through the single chapters to get an overview of what's in there. The first is just basically looking into who's involved, listing down the actors so that they can be followed up with in case there are questions. Then also the basic information on the NDC. So is it a revision? Is it a new NDC? What was the submission date? and what were the main inputs used in preparation. And basically just naming down policies or strategies that are flowing into this, but also studies and reports that were already there. Because obviously all of this is relevant for the next time as you want to build on the first NDC and the revision process this time in the future. Next slide, please, Hosea. So the second chapter is looking into the scoping of the NDC. This is nailing down what is the lead institution and what were their responsibilities. That's mostly the Ministry of Environment, I suppose. And then looking into the enhancement and ambition processes. So is there more mitigation ambition in the NDC? Is there an additional adaptation section, or is the information on that improved? Has the transparency been improved, for instance, by changing to a certain presentation of the target that is easier to verify? And also, what were the limitations for further enhancement on any of those areas that have been enhanced? So, for instance, data limitations for some sectors to cover them, or a lack of finance to go above the level of mitigation ambition already taken down in the NDC, whatever it might be. And then the brief overview basically of the methodology. So which stakeholder consultations have been conducted, or has the implementation plan been included, or do we have some technical analysis behind the NDC, and where do we find that? And that's basically it for this part. Then the next section is looking into the external support received and required. So what type was actually asked for, and probably what were the capacity constraints leading to that? What type of support was provided? Was it financial support? Was it capacity building? And then also what were the synergies and overlaps between implementing partners, if any were available? So did they actually work together well, or did you have to coordinate them closely, or were there overlaps between what they have been doing, basically repeating work and slowing down the process, which is obviously something we want to avoid. So that's good to know for the next time. And then there's a section for recommendations for the next round of hopefully less support in revising the NDC, what needs to be covered and what needs to be taken into consideration to get the maximum out of the process. And then the fourth section is looking into the coordination more closely. So what coordination mechanism was in place, and how does it work between country and partners? What was the frequency, also to figure out how much time it would take, and what were the allocated capacities? So how many people were working on it, but also what kind of technology was used, or were there any meetings required, and is that sufficient, or does it require more effort next time? And we are looking into the participating organizations so that we can still reach out to them. So basically, which organization has been involved, and find contact details for these organizations, find people responsible there, and what was their role in the revision process. Then the next section, the fifth one, is looking into stakeholder engagement, very short one. Basically just naming down the stakeholders and what role they played. So that's national stakeholders, and how far they have been advising the process, and also then figuring out what can be improved or what needs to be considered for the next round of revisions. For instance, if you want to cover another sector, you probably also need to think about which stakeholders are relevant. Is that already part of what you have been thinking about in the first round here? Then probably important to nail that down for the next time, so that we don't have to start from scratch. And then the sixth section is the most important one from my point of view as a technical advisor. Here we are first looking into baseline model development for the NDC. So normally you want to know where your emission trajectory is going without interventions, and also want to know against which target year your targets are set, what are the emissions in that year, and that all needs to be modeled normally because it's not necessarily obvious. And the main questions here are, has there been used any software for modeling that, or what were the basic assumptions behind modeling, and where do we find those? But also what type of data was used, basically from GHG inventories, for instance, in the national communications, or in any PUR you might have, or what other sources have been required for that. And then second, where is the data, basically? Because that is the part that takes the most time, trying to find out who has information on, for instance, how many power plants are operating with fossil fuel and what is their capacity. These are things that are normally known, but it's not necessarily clear where to find it. And also, what were the gaps in the data that was available? So, for instance, did you know how many EV charging stations were around, or is that a problem in determining the baseline? And then there is one of these nice little boxes again, where you can see for the future where the data was retrieved and which institutions were involved and where it is stored for next time so that it can be used. The main point being, obviously, that your baseline needs to stay roughly the same if possible. Can't compare the increased ambition of the next NDC if you have to use completely different information from for baseline construction to understand where you actually are. So that's the baseline. And now, slide, please. The question about mitigation. And here the question, first of all, is which scenarios have been developed or were already available from previous work, and who did that? And then what was the rationale for selecting a certain scenario for your final NDC level of ambition? And that is also obviously most crucial. It has the same limitations as the baseline, and obviously often data isn't available, and it's important to close data gaps in the future, so it's important to understand where these limitations have been. But it's also important for the next revision round to understand what the scenario actually looks like. So how was it informed and how is it selected? What were the obstacles of selecting probably a more ambitious one? And what are the data gaps that leave open questions in that scenario? Then secondly, about the scenario modeling itself. So recording the assumptions made, because as you're probably all aware, modeling is a form of art and most people have different approaches to that. And these assumptions define where your model goes to. So knowing these assumptions is basically the central part of understanding how the scenario works and also of changing the scenario. And assumptions might change over time. For instance, if you have a vastly expanding transport sector, with new diesel cars, for instance, you would also have higher assumptions, higher emissions assumed in that sector in the next revision round, and you probably couldn't know that 5 years ago. So these are important, but also writing down what the challenges have been, and if possible, thinking about future solutions to these challenges so that you can, for instance, expand into other sectors and maybe also expand the level of ambition in certain sectors which have been so far problematic due to lack of data, due to lack of information. And then finally, where is the general data? So these scenarios produce a lot of data, and obviously next time it might make life much easier if you can tap into that and use it for the new development of scenarios in your NDC revision process. Often it's not clear where that data is housed, and it's also difficult to figure out who has access. It's not necessarily the government. Might be sitting at a university or at an institution supporting the country that time around, and then it can be challenging to actually find that and get access. So that's the mitigation part. And then we have a data handover sheet, which can help to locate information in the future. So this is just an Excel sheet accompanying the checklist, and it can be filled in mostly, I think, by the implementing partners. So whoever does, for instance, modeling and inventory work to inform the baseline and the mitigation scenarios would be privy to this kind of information. And it's an effective way of collecting it just by sector in the IPCC, to make sure that all of the information used in one round of NDC development can also be tapped into in the next round, and that you can also align information with the reporting requirements. We have this for every sector. It's nevertheless a very short sheet. So for instance, that's what it looks like for IPPU. And it's the same for the other sectors in repetition. We have subsectors in here under the sector, so we can, for instance, look into what the electronics industry has been doing in the first NDC and what has changed in the second, or we can look at agricultural aspects. It's in here just for recording, mostly by the implementing partner, I would think. So what we are covering is it included in the NDC, and what was the quantitative target? Where is data that has been used, and can we access that actually? And then, most importantly, what were the modeling assumptions, if any, and what were the target setting assumptions, or why is there no target? So often certain sectors couldn't be covered because of lack of information. I think IPPU, in the cases I've been working with, was never covered because there's no data. So that obviously wants to be remedied in the future, and already knowing that from the start is very helpful. And you don't have to pick up the phone and call all of the line ministries to find out if there's any information. You already know that there's a gap that wants to be closed. And since this takes time, it's also helpful to know that early on. So that's the handover sheet. And then equally important as adaptation. I mean, that's mostly what the new NDCs are covering, in addition to what they did before, a longer section on adaptation. But there's a lot of science behind that too, in many cases. And then obviously the first thing to record is what type of data and information was used. So has the country had an apps, SASAPs access to develop from? Have there been any vulnerability assessments done or something like that? That could be used for this section, but also what type of assessments have been developed and used in the end in order to inform the sections. Often these vulnerability assessments, if they haven't been there, some external partner might have developed one to figure out what the adaptation priorities would likely look like in the next 5 years. And for that, there's again a huge of data and modeling behind it. So it would be nice to write down where this data is located and who might have access to that. In most cases, this will again be the external advisors and partners, as well as the universities involved. And again, room for recommendations for the future for adaptation. This is also an area which is probably likely to be revised every 5 years as climate change progresses and poses new challenges. So these were the two most important parts. And now a short section included on the linkages with the other processes. So this was something interesting that we found out, that in many cases there are processes ongoing in parallel, like for instance BUR process, or actually the NAP is being developed in parallel, or there is a UNFCCC NetCom, National Communication, in preparation. And all of these make similar assumptions and similar recommendations as the NDCs, in fact. And since all of these are obviously also publicly recorded, it would be nice to have them more or less aligned. But that is only possible if it's obvious that these processes are happening in parallel. And then obviously we need to align, and we have a short section included to write down what the coordination with these processes looked like and how that were affecting the NDC revision process. The lessons from that for the future are then obviously to try to set that up from the start. Yeah. Sorry, Rosia, didn't want to confuse you. And then the final two ones. This is first on the drafting of the updated NDC. So what type of references were used and what type of resources otherwise to structure the NDC? Where did that inspiration come from? For instance, if you've used an ICTU table to comply with the Katowice framework, something like that. Then what did the stakeholder feedback cycle look like? So was the final document published somewhere so that people can share their opinions, and who was part of that process? Which languages were available for that, and what was the accessibility of the documents, or where was it actually shared for any feedback? And finally, how did the stakeholder feedback flow into the final document? So how was it incorporated in the NDC? This is not always happening. Not every country is using such an approach, that the final document is still being shared with a broader group of stakeholders. Might also just be the ministry, in which case this section is redundant. But often at least a few line ministries involved in the final implementation of the NDC are also involved in the final verification of the document and the targets, so that they can actually be certain to be able to comply. And then the last one is just the approval process of the revised NDC. So what was the national validation process? That's mostly going through cabinet and approving the document, and then how was it submitted? And are there any recommendations for future revision cycles coming from these last steps in the process? And that's about it. And as I said, it's about an hour to fill in the most basic information. So it shouldn't hurt too much if also you reach out to your implementing partners and try to convince them to hand over whatever information they have to make your lives easier with this part as well. And with that, thank you, Rosia. Back to you.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, and let me maybe share some considerations that would be very useful when you plan to fill in the handover checklist. So as Jan mentioned, the handover checklist in purpose is developed as a Word file in order to allow flexibility in making adjustments to the needs, to the interests of the country, how the country wants to fill in the checklist based on their country circumstances and how the NDC was updated in the country. And at the same time, it's really important to know that even though it is, not a big document, it's quite difficult for only one person to fill it in alone. Therefore, the filling in of the checklist is ideally should be a collaboration process among different stakeholders. First of all, it is the national NDC focal point who was leading the revision of the NDC, as well as the concerned ministries and agencies that were also providing their information, and probably were also involved in sector studies that were conducted, as well as external partners, whether it is with the support of international and local consultants. So these all have this huge amount of very important information that needs to be collected and needs to be stored in this checklist. Such collection of information can also be done via a short reflection session or a workshop where the key stakeholders come together in a session and then can jointly fill in the information or indicate where such information can be found. And secondly, as I mentioned, it's very important for the NDC focal point to lead the process, to be involved in the process, because it is the agency that might be also responsible for the NDC updating in the future. And it will be also very, it's a big support for the agency to have such resource that they can rely on to prepare and to plan ahead. It is advisable that development partners who were part of this NDC revision process can also help in filling in this checklist, because their support might be very valuable, not only because they have the information, but also because they have the resources to help and fill it in. And very important point is about where to store once the checklist is filled in, the location and accessibility of this tool. Because as I mentioned also at the very beginning, the access and availability to different sources of data is one of the big issues. There might be data available, but finding out where it is and how to access it can also take quite a lot of time and can cause delays. Therefore, it is advised also to decide whether where the tool will be stored once it is filled in, whether it is in a digital format or whether it is an online storage place. Important is that, the country decides itself where to store it and to whom it can also make it accessible. So this is, again, completely at the merit of each country. and make sure that the document is stored and is available in the coming 2-3 years. As you know, in the run-up to 2025, countries will be submitting their updated NDC, or are recommended to update and submit their updated NDCs. Therefore, time is again quite short. And such tools we think that could be very, very useful for countries to save time, to save resources, and more importantly, to build the knowledge of all the climate-related data in the country. And it doesn't move. Let me use the arrow again. Okay. And of course, where to find out and how to download this NDC Handover Checklist. We uploaded the document into the website of Partnership on Transparency in the Paris Agreement. The checklist is available in 5 languages, in English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Russian, in order to make it as easy as possible for everyone to fill in. Both the Excel sheet and the Word document are available in these languages. The NDC Partnership Support Unit also included the checklist in their climate toolbox, so this website can also be used to as a resource. And lastly, of course, please feel free to reach to us at GIZ, PADPA, and also at Climate Analytics. In case if you need help, in case if you need, if you have any questions related to the NDC checklist, and we are happy to help you. And we then would like to take some time in order to hear back from you, and let us know what are your impressions, whether do you have any questions that we can answer. Please feel free. So this session is open for questions and comments. Are there any questions from anyone? Whether everything is clear, whether you have any ideas about what we shared here. Maybe you already know how this can be useful for your country or for your partner ministry. Very also interesting for us to hear about where such checklists could be stored, that it is accessible, and that it is also in accordance with all the rules and regulations of a country. So please feel free. I will also add here the direct links for you where you can download it. So far, no questions, no comments.
Rosia, may I ask a question, please?
Yes, yes, please, go ahead.
So, Jan, I wanted to ask maybe both of you that recently, after COP26, Glasgow Climate Pact was, established. We should follow those recommendations, which include Glasgow Climate Pact, right? And one of those items are related to NDC. And could you explain what do you see how to redevelop or revisit NDC in coming year? That exact title was to revisit NDCs for the next COP, right? All of us, we know that, for example, Kyrgyzstan just updated NDC and submitted to before COP26. And the same may happen with all of those member countries. And could you explain how do you have any idea what does it mean, that word revisit? Of course, to raise ambition, but in which way we should to implement that recommendation? We should update it again or something else? Thank you.
Yeah, that's obviously a political question, and I think the COP hasn't pushed every country to submit targets that are much more ambitious than what they currently submitted. They basically asked countries that have capacities to increase their ambition to do so this year already. So it's not necessarily my interpretation of what they have agreed upon, that every country needs to submit a new NDC. That is, first of all, not the case. But if you have anything in the NDC that you could be quicker in implementing, for instance, or if you have anything left out of the NDC that is theoretically possible to cover, I think it's a good idea to think about that. And obviously, since the revision process isn't very long ago, it might be easier this year, in fact, to do this and probably try to get support for that as well, compared to later next year or in 2 years' time. And always keeping in mind that the NDC is kind of a double-edged sword, because on the one hand, you are binding yourself to raise ambition and reduce emissions faster than you had set before, which comes with political but also economic costs. But on the other hand, it is also a signal to those countries and organizations that can help implementing such NDCs that there is this kind of ambition and interest in investing in the economy to align with Paris-compatible pathways. And that is always also, a potential opportunity, at least, to be a thought leader on the process and to be an economic leader in the process and actually materialize benefits. Because there are areas in most countries where it is actually economically beneficial to reduce emissions already at this point. And I think that is the broad context I would read this statement in. So, for instance, in many countries, we are still planning to build coal power plants, or we are still planning to build diesel generators for power generation, which are outcompeted by now by renewable energy sources in almost all countries. So, for instance, if there would be something like that left in your NDC that you have submitted, it would be beneficial economically to reconsider that and take it out. That's basically the thing. And in terms of the process, I think since the NDC is based on an assessment in most cases of what is feasible and what is possible, it is pretty obvious at this point, I think, what is left, what options are left to increase ambition, because they have been considered last year in most cases. In some cases, there was not sufficient support, obviously. And that is then something that the international community needs to help with. But since they have been considered in most cases for most sectors even, I think it's comparably easy, at least, to find out if there are any remaining potentials that can be lifted. I don't know if that answered your question, but that would be my piece of advice for this. Noting, obviously, that bringing down emissions in countries which already have very low emissions in the first place, which is the case for most LDCs and a large number of SIDs, and also for many other developing countries, can be quite complicated in comparison to states that are more developed and rich. So that is also an aspect, I think, that is part of the statement. It's supposed to ask those that have less ambitious NDC and a very high share in the global emissions to do more, would be my reading, compared to those that don't.
Thank you.
Nonetheless, yeah, I hope that partially answers your question. But the main part from our technical side here is the argument that it should be easier to do it right now than to do it in 2 years' time. Thank you for the question. It's a political, but also a very interesting one.
Yeah, thank you, Dastan. It is, I think, a question that many countries are asking right now, looking at the outcomes of COP26, what these outcomes mean for each country. And definitely these outcomes should be viewed in respective to each country's circumstances. And also maybe interesting to note that there were actually countries who updated their NDCs twice ahead of COP26. And so probably there will be also other countries who might consider updating their NDCs prior to COP27. And so, yeah, it is very much based on the interests and needs of each country, but it is also, gives a scope for countries to decide for themselves. And also based on our experiences, we know that many countries really use the opportunity of this NDC update process to collect more robust data, to improve and update their greenhouse gas inventories, to conduct really in-depth studies, analyses for certain sectors, whether it is energy, agriculture, forestry, and so on. So this was, I think, one of the very important achievements that one can note, that countries really worked hard on enhancing their baseline information. Thank you. Thank you, Dastan. And are there any other comments, suggestions? So, I don't see any hands, and I did share here in the chat the direct links where you can download the checklist in all the languages. Please note that the checklist is a separate file in Word document, and the Excel sheet is a separate file. So they are not as a single file, but as two separate files that you have to download also separately. As I also noted earlier, we will make available the recording of this event, and we will also share the slides that we presented today to all of you. So thank you very much for joining. Please use this opportunity to ask your questions and share your feedback. We are also happy to hear from you in case you are interested to use the checklist, and in case you need some support, or please also feel free to share with us your feedback. We are happy to hear feedback on the checklist itself, in terms of the content that it is covering, as well as the format. So please do share with us. And maybe one another remark is that the purpose of the checklist is to document the process and all relevant resources and actors. We are not much emphasizing what went into the NDC itself. So it doesn't provide a description of what is an NDC, rather than how the NDC was updated. So this is also maybe useful to keep in mind. And Jan, do you want to add something?
No, I think you covered it. I mean, this last point is obviously important because it's called the nationally determined contribution for a reason, and there cannot be a blueprint or something how it should be structured. And I'm very sure this checklist comes nowhere near that either. So it's about your particular case. It's not about how it should look like. But obviously, the negotiations in Glasgow and also before in Katowice have provided a few guidelines what an NDC should be covering in terms of transparency in particular. And the checklist is supposed to help with complying with that. And it's hopefully also doing that. We haven't tested it, so we have to find out. But I am very confident that this is a good step in the direction of helping to comply with the transparency framework. Thanks.
Yeah. Maybe, in terms of the testing, I wanted also to add that we are on a pilot base, hearing that some countries are interested to fill in their checklist, since, these are also the countries that just updated their NDCs. We from ourselves will also support countries to fill it in, because as we mentioned, it takes some time and some resources to fill it in. So once again, we advise also for you to reach out to your partners that might be also interested to help in filling in the checklist. Good. Then with that, I wanted to maybe share the last slide again with you, just to remind you about our contact details. I think I did miss it in my last slide. And yeah, here are our contact details. You will find them also in the slide deck that we will share with you. But me and Jan and the colleagues who are part of developing this NDC handover checklist, we will be happy to support you on that, and feel free to reach out to us. Thank you from my side, and yeah, I think with that we can close the session today. Thank you very much for joining today. Thank you for listening, and please use the checklist and let us know. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dastan.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Good night, good evening, good morning to others still. Bye-bye.